The day was heavy with grief, the air filled with the muffled sobs of family and the distant toll of the church bell. The scent of flowers, meant to honor the dead, only deepened the weight of sorrow that hung over everyone gathered. Friends and relatives filled the hall, their black attire blending into a sea of mourning. At the front of the room stood the casket, polished and adorned with roses, a painful reminder of the life that had just ended. The millionaire's mother had been a woman admired and respected, and her loss left a void that no amount of wealth could fill. Beside the grieving husband stood his pregnant wife, her hand resting gently on his arm, her other hand protectively over the swell of her belly. Despite her own exhaustion and the toll the pregnancy had taken on her, she stood tall, determined to be a pillar of support. She whispered words of comfort, hoping to ease even a fraction of his pain, but his eyes remained distant, his jaw set in a cold expression that betrayed little emotion. To anyone watching, she looked like a devoted wife, standing loyally at her husband's side in his time of need. Just a few steps away, the elderly father sat in silence, his shoulders bent, his face lined with years of wisdom and now carved even deeper by grief. The death of his lifelong companion had left him broken in ways words could not describe. He clutched a handkerchief tightly in his wrinkled hands, his eyes fixed on the casket as if willing his wife to rise once more. His frailty was plain, and each shallow breath seemed a struggle, but his presence carried dignity even in his sorrow. Though everyone mourned, beneath the solemnity lay an unspoken tension, a ripple of unease that no one could quite name yet. While mourners wept openly and whispered prayers, the millionaire stood apart in spirit, his posture stiff, his gaze sharp and calculating. Outwardly, he looked like a grieving son paying respects to his late mother, but those who looked closely noticed the absence of warmth in his eyes. His wife clung gently to his arm, searching for some sign of shared sorrow, yet he barely acknowledged her presence. The weight of her touch seemed more like a burden than a comfort. In the days leading up to the funeral, his behavior had shifted in subtle but unmistakable ways. Where once he had pretended to be attentive, now his replies were short and clipped, his late nights more frequent, his mind clearly elsewhere. He checked his watch too often during the service, as though the ritual of saying goodbye to his mother was little more than an inconvenient pause in his otherwise busy life. Some whispered that grief made men strange, but in his case, it revealed something deeper, an arrogance that grew in the absence of compassion. The wife, tender-hearted and devoted, tried not to see it. She brushed away her own tears quietly, offering him tissues, trying to bridge the widening gap with kindness. But he didn't meet her eyes. He was more concerned with the whispers of business partners in attendance, more focused on his image than the raw pain of family loss. He had become obsessed with appearances, with making sure the world still saw him as powerful and untouchable, even on a day meant for humility. The elderly father noticed. From his chair, he studied his son with sorrow greater than words. While he himself grieved the love of his life, he also grieved the man his son was becoming, a man whose heart seemed hollow, whose gaze was cold even as his wife, carrying his child, stood faithfully by his side. Despite her own exhaustion, the wife moved quietly through the day, ensuring everyone was tended to. She offered tissues to relatives, comforted children confused by the sight of so many tears, and checked in on her father-in-law, guiding him gently when his frail steps faltered. Her hands, though trembling slightly from the weight of her pregnancy, carried trays of water and plates of food, refusing to let anyone else shoulder the responsibility. It wasn't duty that drove her, it was love, a deep devotion to the family she had married into, even when her own heart felt neglected. She barely thought of herself. Her swollen ankles ached from standing too long, and the weight in her belly made each movement slower, yet she never complained. Instead, she forced a calm smile whenever someone met her eyes, masking the storm of worry that brewed inside. She saw the distance in her husband's expression, the way his hand slipped away from hers too quickly, the hollow words he spoke to her when others weren't listening. Still, she stayed close, believing that love meant patience, that his heart would return to her if she just held on a little longer. When the father-in-law's voice cracked as he tried to recite a prayer for his departed wife, it was the pregnant wife who knelt beside him, holding his hand, whispering encouragement until he found his strength again. The old man looked at her with gratitude, his eyes wet, silently acknowledging her as the anchor the family so desperately needed. Even in the face of her husband's coldness, her devotion never wavered. She carried the weight of sorrow, pregnancy, and rejection all at once, yet she still stood tall, an unshakable presence in a house crumbling under grief. The funeral had nearly reached its quiet end when the unthinkable happened. Guests whispered softly, preparing to leave, while the elderly father lingered in his seat, staring at the casket of the woman he had loved for a lifetime. The atmosphere was still heavy with mourning, but within that silence, the millionaire made a choice that would forever scar the family. As his pregnant wife approached him, her eyes red from weeping yet still searching for some trace of comfort, he pulled a crisp envelope from the inside pocket of his suit. The gesture was mechanical, almost rehearsed, as though this moment had been waiting for its stage. Without lowering his voice, without sparing even a shred of consideration for time or place, he extended the envelope toward her. "You need to sign these," he said flatly. Her trembling hand reached for the papers, confused at first. She thought perhaps it was a document related to his mother's estate, some urgent matter he had overlooked. But as her eyes scanned the bold heading, her breath caught in her throat. Divorce. The word screamed louder than any church bell, louder than the sobs around her. A document meant to end their marriage, thrust into her hands at the funeral of his mother, while she carried his unborn child. The silence shattered. Gasps rippled through the crowd, whispers rising like waves. Relatives exchanged horrified glances, some covering their mouths in disbelief. The pregnant wife stood frozen, her tears spilling faster now, not only for the mother-in-law she had just buried, but for the life she thought she still shared with her husband. She had stood by him in grief, given him her loyalty, and carried his child, and he repaid her with abandonment in the cruelest way possible. The elderly father, already fragile, turned his head sharply. His frail body seemed to tremble with rage and sorrow as his gaze fell on the papers in her hands. His lips quivered as though searching for words, but all he could do was clutch his chest, staring at his son as though seeing him for the first time. The betrayal was too raw, too public, too unforgivable. The wife's knees threatened to buckle, but she held herself upright, clutching her belly instinctively as though shielding her child from the ugliness of the moment. Relatives rushed toward her, their voices filled with outrage. "Here. Now." Someone cried. Another muttered, "Shameful," at his own mother's funeral. The millionaire, unmoved, only adjusted his cufflinks, his jaw set as though this were just another business transaction. His coldness cut deeper than the papers themselves, and the pregnant wife realized in that instant that the man she had loved no longer existed. He had chosen ambition and arrogance over compassion, wealth over family, and appearances over love. In that sacred space meant to honor the dead, he had buried something else too, the last remnants of dignity in their marriage. The elderly father's heart could bear no more. Already crushed by the loss of his beloved wife, the sight of his son handing divorce papers to a pregnant woman at a funeral, his own wife's funeral, was more than his frail body could endure. His hand shook violently as he pointed at the papers, his voice breaking into a strangled cry that echoed through the mourners. "What have you done?" he gasped, his eyes filled with disbelief, horror, and an anguish too deep for words. Before anyone could answer, his chest heaved as if the air had suddenly grown too heavy for his lungs. His cane slipped from his grip, clattering against the wooden floor. Then, in a moment that froze the room, his knees buckled, and he collapsed forward, his body crumpling under the weight of grief and betrayal. Gasps and screams erupted among the guests, the chaos overtaking the solemn quiet that had filled the hall only moments before. The pregnant wife, still clutching the divorce papers, cried out in alarm, rushing to his side as best she could despite the heaviness of her pregnancy. Relatives rushed forward, forming a circle around the fallen patriarch. Some fanned him desperately, others shouted for a doctor, while the priest himself hurried to kneel beside the old man. His face was pale, his breaths shallow and ragged, each one sounding like it could be his last. Through the chaos, the millionaire stood motionless. He didn't kneel, didn't reach for his father's hand, didn't cry out in fear. His eyes flickered briefly, betraying a moment of discomfort, but it was swallowed quickly by the same mask of cold detachment he had worn all day. Whispers rose around him, sharp and venomous now. How could he? one relative muttered. He killed his father with shame, another spat. The elderly father's eyes fluttered open for a moment. With the last reserves of his strength, he reached out, not for his son, but for his daughter-in-law. His wrinkled fingers clutched hers tightly, the papers still crumpled in her other hand. His lips moved weakly, but the message was clear. She was the true heart of the family, the one he trusted to carry on the love that his son had thrown away. Then, with a groan of pain, he slipped into unconsciousness, his fragile body succumbing to the storm of emotions that had broken him. The sight left the room in stunned silence. Grief for the mother had already filled the air, but now another tragedy hovered dangerously close. And in the center of it all stood the millionaire, colder than stone, his betrayal the spark that had shattered what little peace remained. The hall that once echoed with solemn prayers now buzzed with furious whispers. Relatives huddled in corners, voices sharp with disbelief and outrage. Divorce papers, at his mother's funeral, one muttered, shaking his head in disgust. Another leaned in closer, lowering her voice but unable to contain her anger. It has to be money. He's chasing something bigger, and she's in his way. The murmurs swelled, weaving through the crowd until every guest seemed to carry the same mixture of shock and condemnation. The pregnant wife sat near the unconscious father-in-law, her face pale and streaked with tears. Though she had said nothing, the whispers swirled around her like daggers. She could hear every word, that she was too gentle for such a man, that he must have someone else waiting in the shadows, that greed had replaced the blood in his veins. Her heart ached not just for herself, but for the family's honor, which had been trampled underfoot by the very man who should have protected it. Meanwhile, the millionaire's face remained unbothered, his jaw tight, his eyes refusing to meet anyone else's. His cold indifference only fueled the speculation further. Some guests sneered openly now, their respect for him shattered. A cousin muttered under his breath, "He doesn't deserve to carry his father's name." Others nodded, shaking their heads in agreement, as if a curtain had been pulled back and they finally saw the truth of who he was. It wasn't just a scandal anymore, it was betrayal of blood, of love, of the very values the family had been built upon. And though no one dared confront him directly in that moment, the judgment in their eyes was louder than words, painting him not as a grieving son, but as a heartless betrayer. The wife sat in stunned silence, her hands trembling as they rested on her swollen belly. The divorce papers lay crumpled beside her, yet their weight felt heavier than stone pressing against her chest. She had prepared herself for sorrow that day, the sorrow of saying goodbye to the woman who had welcomed her into the family, the sorrow of supporting her grieving husband, the sorrow of watching her father-in-law break under loss. But she had never prepared for this. Betrayal had carved itself into her heart so suddenly, so brutally, that even tears felt powerless to express it. Her body shook with grief, but she forced herself to remain upright, her back straight, her expression composed. For the sake of the child within her, she refused to crumble. She placed her hand over her belly, whispering silently to the little life she carried, promising protection no matter how shattered her own heart was. The whispers of relatives reached her ears, some filled with sympathy, others sharp with anger at the man she had once called her partner. Each word stung, but she bore it quietly, swallowing her pain so it would not consume her. Her gaze drifted to the elderly father, lying pale and fragile after collapsing from the shock. The sight of him stirred something deeper than despair, a sense of duty. She realized she could not abandon him, not when he had reached for her hand instead of his son's. In that moment, she understood her role was no longer just that of a betrayed wife, but of a daughter-in-law who must carry the love and dignity the family had lost. She longed to scream, to demand answers from the man who stood so coldly across the room, but she knew it would be wasted breath. He had already made his choice, and words could not thaw the ice in his heart. So she chose silence, a silence that carried strength. It was not weakness to endure quietly, it was courage. She would survive this betrayal. She would raise her child in love. She would honor the family where her husband had failed. And though her heart was breaking, her resolve began to harden like steel. When the elderly father regained consciousness, his breathing was shallow but his spirit remained fierce. Supported by two relatives, he struggled to sit upright, his frail hands clutching the armrest of his chair. His eyes, though dimmed by age and grief, burned with a fire that silence could no longer contain. The room hushed as he turned his gaze upon his son, the very man who had shattered the family's dignity at its most vulnerable moment. His voice, though cracked with weakness, carried the weight of authority. "Is this what your mother raised you to be?" he asked, each word trembling but sharp as a blade. "A man who dishonors his wife while burying his mother? A man who breaks his home while carrying his child in another?" The room grew still, every eye fixed on the confrontation. The millionaire stiffened but said nothing, his jaw tight, his arrogance wavering under the intensity of his father's stare. The old man pressed on, his voice growing louder despite the pain in his chest. "We taught you loyalty. We taught you respect. Yet here you stand, parading your selfishness before the family, before God, before the woman carrying your child. You shame not only yourself but the blood that runs in your veins." Tears welled in the father's eyes as his frail hand gestured toward the pregnant wife. "She is more my child than you are my son," he declared, his voice breaking. "For she has shown love, devotion, and honor where you have given none. You have lost your way, and if you do not see it now, you will live long enough to regret it." The weight of his words settled like thunder in the hall, leaving the son momentarily stripped of his cold facade, exposed before everyone as the man who had failed not just his wife, but his family and his name. The room hung heavy with his father's words, but the millionaire refused to bow beneath their weight. Straightening his shoulders, he let silence stretch before answering, his voice calm yet laced with arrogance. "I will not apologize," he said, his tone flat, as if speaking to business associates rather than family. "This marriage has been nothing but a chain around my neck. I have no desire to live bound to someone I no longer love. She was convenient once, but now? Now she's a burden." Gasps rippled through the mourners. The wife lowered her eyes, her hand instinctively cradling her belly, but she said nothing. The old man shook his head slowly, his lips trembling, but the son continued, growing bolder. "Do you think love keeps an empire standing? Do you think devotion feeds success? No. It takes focus, it takes freedom. And I will not sacrifice my future for obligations I never asked for. Not for her. Not for anyone." His words were sharp, cutting not only into his wife but into the very fabric of the family name. He glanced at the guests, his expression daring them to disagree. "Yes, I gave her these papers today. Why wait? The sooner she understands her place in my life, or lack of one, the sooner I can move forward. My mother's death only reminds me how short life is. I will not waste another moment living a lie." His father let out a broken sound, a mix of sorrow and fury, but the son pressed on. "I don't care for traditions, for appearances, or for what any of you whisper behind my back. Wealth gives me the right to choose my life, and I choose to be free. She and her child will not anchor me. I am not cruel, I'll provide for them financially. But as for love, as for marriage, I owe her nothing more." The coldness of his declaration settled like frost across the room. Even those who had once admired his ambition now looked at him with disgust, realizing that behind his wealth lay nothing but emptiness. The wife listened to every word, each syllable like a blade slicing into her heart. Her hands clutched her belly protectively, as if shielding her child from the cruelty spilling from his father's mouth. Tears streaked her cheeks, but she did not allow herself to crumble. Not here. Not before him. Not before those who had witnessed her humiliation. She drew in a trembling breath, straightened her back, and made her decision. Without a word, she gathered the papers from where they had fallen near her chair. She pressed them to her chest for a moment, as though holding the weight of everything she had lost. Then, moving with a dignity that belied her pain, she rose slowly to her feet. The room fell into silence, the guests watching her every step as she turned away from the man who had once vowed to protect her. Relatives rushed forward, some offering to carry her bag, others whispering words of comfort. Her father-in-law reached for her hand again, his frail grip pleading with her not to vanish, but she bent down gently, kissed his forehead, and whispered softly, "I will take care of myself and the child. You rest." Her voice cracked, but there was steel beneath it. The millionaire stood motionless, his cold eyes tracking her every step as though she were a stranger. If he expected her to beg, he was disappointed. She would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her broken. Each step toward the door was a declaration. She might be abandoned, but she was not defeated. When she finally crossed the threshold and disappeared from sight, a murmur of approval rose among the mourners. For in her quiet departure, she carried more dignity than the man who had shamed her. And though her heart ached, she vowed silently that she would rise again, not for him, but for herself and the child growing inside her. The old man sat slumped in his chair, his chest heaving as though every breath came at a great cost. His eyes followed the doorway where his daughter-in-law had just vanished, and a tear rolled down his weathered cheek. He lifted his trembling hand to wipe it away, but his strength faltered. The room remained hushed, all eyes fixed on him, waiting to hear what he would say. When he finally spoke, his voice was soft but carried the weight of generations. "I have lost my wife today," he began, pausing to gather air, "and I fear I have lost my son long before this moment." His words fell heavy, and the guests shifted uncomfortably. He turned his gaze toward the millionaire, the very man who had once been his pride. "You stand tall with wealth and arrogance, but you are smaller than I have ever seen you. A man without honor is no man at all." The son opened his mouth to reply, but his father raised a frail hand to silence him. "Do not speak. You have spoken enough. I will say this, your mother died believing in the goodness within you. She carried that hope to her grave. But today, you killed it for me." His eyes glistened as he choked back his emotions. "From this day, I will not call you son. The one you cast aside, the one carrying your child, she is my family. She is the only reason I will pray for your blood to continue." Gasps echoed through the mourners, the words like thunder in the silence of the mourning hall. The father's shoulders sagged, but his spirit had released what needed to be said. "You may keep your riches, your power, your empire," he said, voice trembling but clear. "But you will find them hollow when there is no one left to share them with. A man who cannot honor love will never taste peace." Exhausted, his head fell back against the chair, his chest rising and falling weakly. The truth had been spoken, and though it broke him, it also freed him from carrying the shame of his son's choices. The air in the morning hall was already heavy with grief and scandal when the sound of clicking heels broke the silence. Heads turned, and whispers rippled through the crowd as the mistress appeared in the doorway. Dressed in a sleek black dress that clung to her figure, her rounded belly unmistakable beneath the fabric, she stepped forward without hesitation, her chin lifted high. She carried herself not as an intruder but as though she belonged, a brazen contrast to the solemn atmosphere of the funeral. Her eyes darted briefly to the millionaire, and he stiffened, his composure wavering before he strode to meet her halfway. Without shame, he took her hand in his, a gesture that sent fresh gasps through the gathering. The audacity of it, parading his mistress at his mother's funeral, after casting aside his pregnant wife, struck the mourners like a slap. Murmurs swelled, some voices sharp with outrage, others whispering in disbelief. The mistress's lips curved into a faint smile as she surveyed the room. She seemed to thrive on the scandal, her presence a deliberate insult to the woman who had just departed. She leaned closer to the millionaire, her voice loud enough for the nearest relatives to hear. "Now they know where your true loyalty lies," she said, as though claiming a victory. But her confidence only deepened the wound in the old man's heart. His frail body shook with anger as he tried to rise, pointing a trembling finger at the pair. "You dare bring her here?" he rasped, his voice cracking with fury. "On the day we bury your mother? Have you no shame left in your soul?" The mistress's smile faltered for a moment, but the millionaire tightened his grip on her hand, standing firm. "She is my future," he declared coldly. "And everyone here will have to accept it." The audacity of his words stunned the room into silence. The once proud son now stood with the woman who symbolized betrayal, flaunting his choice before the very people mourning his mother's death. In that silence, respect for him shattered completely. The moment the millionaire declared the mistress as his future, the atmosphere shifted entirely. What little sympathy or respect he had left among the mourners dissolved into disgust. Whispered conversations grew louder, echoing like judgmental thunder against the walls of the mourning hall. Some relatives shook their heads in disbelief, others outright turned their backs, unwilling to witness his shamelessness any longer. The family name, once spoken with admiration, now hung heavy with disgrace. The elderly father's shoulders slumped deeper, his heart cracking under the weight of his son's betrayal. Relatives rushed to steady him, but even in his frailty, his voice rose above the murmurs. "You have destroyed what your mother built with her life," he said, trembling with grief. "Her name was honored, her memory was sacred. And today, you spat on both." Guests who had once admired the millionaire's success exchanged glances of horror. They no longer saw a man of power but a man stripped bare, revealed as selfish and hollow. One elderly aunt spoke aloud, her voice quivering with rage. "Your wealth cannot buy respect. It cannot buy love. And it cannot cleanse the stain you have put upon this family." Heads nodded in agreement, the crowd swelling with condemnation. The mistress shifted uncomfortably, her earlier confidence faltering under the piercing stares and whispered curses. She clung tighter to his hand, but her eyes betrayed uncertainty. For the first time, she realized that stepping into his world would not come with admiration, but with loathing. The millionaire, however, forced a smile, though it looked brittle. "Let them talk," he muttered, his voice sharp, as though convincing himself as much as anyone else. "They will learn to accept us in time." But no one answered him. The silence that followed was not acceptance, it was rejection. In that moment, he stood surrounded by wealth and power, yet utterly alone. His family despised him, the community scorned him, and the woman at his side, though clinging to him, could not shield him from the truth. Respect had collapsed like a house of cards, and the ruin was his own doing. The old man's heart, already battered by grief and betrayal, could take no more. His breathing grew shallow, his frail body trembling as he clutched his chest. The room erupted in panic, relatives rushing forward, cries filling the air. But the sight of his son standing hand in hand with the mistress struck him harder than any illness ever could. The weight of loss, shame, and disappointment bore down like a crushing stone, and with one last pained gasp, he collapsed. The hall descended into chaos. Some mourners screamed for a doctor, others wept openly, but all knew the truth. His collapse was not just of the body, but of the soul. His wife had been buried, his daughter-in-law cast aside, and now his son had turned into a stranger before his very eyes. His heart could no longer endure it. The millionaire froze, staring at his father on the ground, his face pale as realization pierced through his arrogance. For the first time that day, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. But pride held him still. He did not kneel, did not reach out. The mistress tugged at his arm, whispering for them to leave before the scene grew uglier. Yet whispers spread through the room like wildfire, condemning him. "He killed his father with shame," one voice hissed. "His greed destroyed everything," said another. Relatives pushed past him, ignoring his presence as they knelt beside the fallen patriarch, their focus only on the man who had carried the family's honor until his last breath. The pregnant wife's absence was felt deeply, her dignity, her quiet strength, and many mourners whispered that had she been there, the old man's heart might have held on longer. The millionaire stood isolated, wealth heavy in his pockets but powerless in that moment. He had everything he thought he wanted, yet nothing of worth remained. Respect was gone, love was gone, family was gone. And as the mistress clutched his arm nervously, he realized what the room already knew. Money could not shield him from the ruin he had brought upon himself. The funeral ended not only with the burial of a mother, but with the collapse of a father's heart and the legacy of a son.